welcome you all to our monthly APSA Café. This is our second event, and we are so glad that you are joining us today, this morning, or afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. We welcome 4 panelists who will be sharing their recent scholarship published in the latest issue of the Journal of Amish and Plain Anabaptist Studies. If you'd like to read more about any of the work discussed today, please do follow the link that I'll be putting in the chat, and you can freely access the journal and read more about any of the research that's being discussed. I'm Natalie Jolly. I'll be moderating today's panel. I'm chair of the APSA Scholarship Committee and an associate professor of sociology at the University of Washington, Tacoma, joining you today from the unprecedentedly hot Pacific Northwest and very bright. We're not used to the sun here. And so we're quite jealous of all of you with air conditioning because we're in the triple digits and we're just not prepared for that. So with an eye on time, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Dr. Roslyn Burns is a historical phonologist and sociolinguist at Yale University, where she studies how contact changes language. And today she'll be discussing her paper titled Contrasting Spaces in Plotdeutsch, Language Variation and Change. Dr. Rivka Neriya-Ben Shahar researches mass media from the perspectives of religion and gender. She's a senior lecturer at Safir Academic College in Sderot, Israel. And today we'll be sharing her research on a paper titled, I'm Just Part of the Community, Amish and Ultra-Orthodox Women and the Third Person Perception. Dr. John Clifton is an orthographer, which if you're like me and just weren't sure what orthography means, it seems to have to do with the spelling and writing conventions of language, but I'm sure John's gonna tell us a little bit more about that. So I'm excited to learn a bit more on that front. Dr. Clifton is a senior linguist consultant with SIL International and will be discussing his paper, Modest Dress Practices Through the Eyes of 7 Conservative Mennonite Women. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Stephen Thalheimer, a superintendent at Elkhart Community Schools in Indiana, and he has been working in publication for in public education for an impressive 27 years. That was sort of exciting to learn a little bit about your career, Steve. He has been a teacher, a curriculum coordinator, an assistant superintendent, and then for the last 8 years, superintendent. So Dr. Thalheimer will be sharing more about his recent paper, A Little More in the World, Why Amish Parents Choose to Send Their Children to Public Schools. So each of the presenters will be speaking for a few minutes about their research, and then we'll open the floor to the audience for questions. And you might consider targeting your questions to all of the panelists rather than just a single presenter so that we really do get to hear from each of them. And I'll begin with the first question. Research on Plain communities in the past has not often included the voices of Plain people. So I'm curious if each of you could speak for a few minutes on how including those voices has augmented your own research and what key findings have emerged from your scholarship that wouldn't have been possible without this direct contact and engagement. Dr. Burns, do you want to begin?
Sure. I would probably say that one of the things that's really important in terms of getting voices of the community in is just listening to people, just starting conversations. One of the things that I learned very quickly when I was learning Plotdeutsch is the phrase "I'm busy," which is kind of like a way to say, you know, I don't have time for this and stuff like that, but you do know that people are genuinely curious, even though they are kind of hesitant to engage if they don't understand who's interested, why anyone would take an interest in their community. So it's really important to constantly engage and constantly listen in order to include the perspective of the community, which is something that's very important in terms of language documentation overall, and Plotdeutsch is an underdocumented language. As far as the findings that can come up through this, I think the whole social motivation for why speakers behave the way that they do wouldn't have been clear without just striking up conversations, getting people to participate, and things like that, even if it's just through like casual commentary. Because a lot of times our studies in sociolinguistics will focus on these post-industrial communities, like New York in the 1960s was basically the classic example that a lot of people look back to. So questions concerning how does religion influence language use? How do concepts of space influence language use? These are things that you couldn't really understand unless you're just constantly looking to engage the community, even if there is a hesitancy at first.
Thank you. Dr. Shahar, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. So I would like to say that first of all, I used to do audience studies or reception studies. In terms of media, usually many people try to figure out what you can find in the media itself. So they do content analysis. I like to hear the people that use the media, not the people that create it or not the message itself, but the people that use it. So listening to women I compare the Amish women and ultra-Orthodox women. So just listen to them or read their answers when they write it. It's so different than to read the media itself. I can say that before I started and I realized my dream to conduct a comparative research between Old Order Amish and Ultra-Orthodox, I paid attention that, you know, without names, I read so many books and articles, and I felt something like this is about the Amish. This is not with the Amish. Maybe I hope that I say that well in English, but what do they think about whatever? So part of the issue is that you don't want to mention their names. Of course not, and I try very hard that nobody can, you know, recognize them. They really want to keep their privacy. However, sometimes it's like, you know, I want to hear them. And then I figure out that most of the research about the Amish are like about the ultra-Orthodox before, it's about the men. Like the men are the community. You can't really see women and children. And of course, you know, adults. So then I found your research, Natalie, and I fall in love with your PhD. I read every word. And Karen Johnson Weiner, of course. And, you know, women listen to women. And I can say that without listening to them, it's not, you know, it's not this. You just need to listen to figure out what really people mean. I can say that I have a problem. When I firstly come to the Amish, I didn't really know English very well. I used to talk in Hebrew and I used to talk in Pennsylvania Dutch. So talking when both of you don't really, you know, their English was much better than mine, but it was a challenge. And actually, I think that it helped to my listening abilities. And I can say that they helped me to understand so many things that I would never understand myself. I felt like they had, I'm not sure that you can say that in English, but they had the gold key, you know, that they can open the door that I want to open. And I definitely don't have the key. So I just need to ask them and they will give it to me. But if you talk about voices, I would say that the most important lesson, I have so many, but the most important lesson I learned from my Amish friends is to be quiet, to listen, to wait before you answer. And I will just tell one anecdote. I listened to the interviews I used to drive with them and record our conversations. They agree. Of course, I took them for the whole day, for shopping all around Lancaster County, but then they answer my questions. And then I listened to the recording and I said to myself, horrible, you are horrible. You hear your voice most of the time. Shut your mouth, please, and listen to them. And you know, I'm Israeli and we used to talk a lot and we cut other people when they're talking. You can see that in many, you know, research studies that Israeli, you know, they're very short and very direct. And I tried to figure out why I did that. And I understood that it was quiet in the car and I couldn't handle it. So I started to talk. And I decided to wait. Next time I will be there, I will count till 30 and let's see what will happen. Almost always after 29 or even 30 or 31, one of them started to talk. And then I asked them, do you count till 30? And they said, no, we just have a sort of education or norm that we should wait, try to understand that nobody else try to take the turn and then we will take our turn. So when I learned to shut my mouth, I learned the most.
That's fantastic. Just the tagline for qualitative research right there, I think. Okay, Dr. Clifton, did you want to share with us?
Okay, I think I'm on now. Yeah, to give you a little bit of background, this was definitely a co-paper between my co-author Megan and I, and it was really mostly her contribution. I'm a sociolinguist. I also teach language and culture documentation, part of the endangered language community. And Megan was a student of mine. She was an MA student writing her thesis. And the whole project began basically as an accident because she came to me and said, can I write the thesis on the Anabaptist community that I grew up in? And I said, sure. And so I assumed that she was coming at it, that she was going to be doing interviews and that she was going to be getting information about Plattdeutsch, Plattdeutsch, whatever the community was speaking. Found out after the fact, after she had already done all of her interviews, that it was an English-speaking community that she was working in, that it was the parents and the grandparents who actually spoke German. And so at that point, we were left scrambling for a topic. And that's where the actual voices came in, because through having the actual voices, it opened up the material for all kinds of other observations. So the observations that I was intending that she would do, would to be looking at the language and how the language had been changing, or how the language was used to talk about this particular area of modest dress, because she was interested in the area of modest dress even when she began. But we found out now that the material that she had, because she actually had the interviews, because she actually had the participants, the narrators' stories themselves, rather than just observations, wordless, and so on, which is what I sort of assumed that was going to happen in the beginning. We could really look in terms of what was the place of modest dress within their community. The other interesting thing is that she was planning to speak to an equal number, and this will be sort of spilling over into the next question. She was planning on interviewing an equivalent number of men and women, and she found very quickly that it was very difficult for her as a young woman to be taken seriously by any of the men. So she only ended up with one interview with a man, and that was the father of one of the young women that she interviewed. But looking back on it again, that it turns out was quite fortuitous, beneficial, because, of course, this was a community which generally had not been looked at. Generally, if you look through the materials, the discussions about dress have been from the male point of view, even if it was about women's dress. And so having these recordings in the words of the women now could put them into context so that it wasn't just a questionnaire or questions here and there, but it was actually an extended conversation. Now you had the words of the narrators within the context of how they thought about dress. And so it morphed very nicely into, well, she still had to write her thesis as a linguistics paper because it was in the linguistics department. So she framed it in the context of the new literacies, but it morphed very nicely into a sociological study instead of a linguistic study. And it was all because we had the words of the narrators in an extended context.
Such an interesting paper too. I recommend everyone go read that one. All of these papers are fantastic. Can we hear a little bit more from you, Dr. Thalheimer, about your paper and some of your findings?
Sure. So in 2013, I was the superintendent of a school district much smaller than one where I am currently, and it has a high percentage of Amish students attending. And in 2013, as we were beginning to emerge a little bit from the Great Recession, there were many Amish families that were making the choice to return to Amish schools. During the period of 2010 to 2012, our enrollment of Amish students had grown, partially just because of trends, but also because of the fact that our education was free and they weren't paying tuition for their Amish schools. But as they started to return, and just some other factors that were at work, we were anecdotally hearing that they were reluctantly returning to their Amish schools. And the principal would have these conversations with me and share with me letters of families saying that they really don't want to leave Millersburg Elementary where they were attending at the time. And so it was very interesting to see this tension that these families were experiencing. And school district, we engaged in a series of some listening tours, smaller groups that became larger focus groups. And out of those conversations, we developed the program where we changed the school from a K-6 elementary school to a K-8 elementary middle school with an emphasis on STEM, STEAM, including the arts, and that it emphasized hands-on learning and inquiry. We were doing that generally across the district, but we really made sure that that was in place and that teachers who wanted to be there and really teach that way to engage the students were there. Through that whole process, we came to understand that they were choosing and appreciating the work that was done at that school for precisely those things. And there were a lot of families that were saying that the college and career readiness, especially the college readiness piece at our junior, senior high school, didn't really apply to students. And so many students were finding that they just went to the junior high, went through the motions, and then withdrew at the end of 8th grade because of Wisconsin v. Yoder. So they just didn't feel that that education connected to them. And so in what we put in place, it matched a lot of the things that in my research, you'll see a reference to McConnell and Hurst from 2006 and 2010. Their research of a Title I school in Ohio referenced that families appreciated the programs, the quality of teachers, the ability to interact with the non-Amish, and we knew those were all factors. But what the series of interviews that I did with those 26 parents allowed me to see was that sense that I had that there was something beyond that. It wasn't just the what or the how that we were giving them, but it was, as my research bore out, the why behind it, that they were engaged in a democratic process and their children were respected and they as family members were respected. And I was really struck by the depth by which some of the respondents shared that just being heard or just being recognized that there was a difference was really important. And one of the things that really triggered this for me as being an area ripe for the research was when we were having these focus groups. We met in the Millersburg Media Center one time, and we had asked families who had been around for a first round of interviews to come for a second and to bring a guest along. So when they came the second time, there was this elderly gentleman sitting back by the book wall, and he didn't say anything the whole evening. And we were discussing, what would you like education to look like? What are we not doing so well? If you could dream, what would it look like? And we had all of these conversations, and we got to the end of the evening, and I said, is there anything we need to hear or think about that we haven't yet? And nobody said anything. The wait time was there. And so when we got to the end of that time, then finally that gentleman just kind of sat up a little more straight in his chair. And he said, I've been waiting 30 years for this conversation to take place. And I'm glad that it finally has. And so knowing that just always stuck with me. And so when I was doing my doctoral work at Indiana State University and they said, what is it that you want to be passionate about and you want to find out more about? I was like, I want to get behind that. I want to understand what that is and how we as a representation of a democratic society really do that and what that means for a people who haven't always been respected by that society.
Fantastic. Yes, I think that really encapsulates what's at stake here. When you listen to the voices, those people then get heard, and that can be such a powerful experience as well. And I wonder if you could all speak to sometimes how difficult it is to even access those voices. And these are sometimes difficult communities to enter, to get access to build that sort of trust. Dr. Thalheimer, that you were talking about, when those connections haven't always been made. So maybe each of you could talk a little bit about access and how you came to enter that community, what brought you here, and how you got in. Dr. Burns, do you want to start again?
Sure. Yeah. So I should start by just saying you know when you go to these communities that you're not a part of them, and they definitely let you know that you're not a part of them. So it's pretty clear there are lines and boundaries. And I think this kind of gets to the point that was being discussed earlier about why do we only hear from the men? Because men are the ones who deal with outsiders. They are the ones in the community that have this particular role. Whereas it makes it really difficult, especially if you're a female researcher going into these groups where they don't really know what to do with you. It's like you're an outsider, therefore men should interact with you, but you're a female who's not related to these men who are interacting with you, therefore it is a bad look for the men to interact with you. And so there's this really difficult tension, but I've also found it's the case in many types of studies. There's something that somebody wants. So I found in my case that some people cared about the language, some people were passionate about the language, but a lot of people just didn't care for it. A lot of people thought there are other languages, there are better languages, there are more useful languages. So coming at it from the language aspect, which is what I'm interested in as a linguist, wasn't really getting me that far, but my interest in education and what are the differences in the different education systems that you have did get me further. The fact that I had actually taught standard German did get me further. The fact that I had practical skills, like I could talk about differences in baking, since I like to bake, got me conversations with women. The fact that I know how to draw and I have technical drawing skills in terms of body structure and stuff like that, did get me further. So there are all of these different skills that you actually have to bring to the table. It can't just be what is traditionally taught in linguistics course of I know how to do elicitation, therefore I am going to get data. It has to be much broader. It has to be, I know how to interact in a variety of different ways. I know that not everybody is going to be passionate about the things that I'm passionate about, but I'm well-rounded enough that I can interact and engage on these other things. And even if I don't get the data that I'm looking for from a particular person, it's still a beneficial relationship to develop. So in order to kind of get past the issue of only being sent to men and only having women wanting to participate, what I did is I developed friendships with several different women, and I identified the ones who had a lot of pull in the community. So they would kind of point me in the direction of people where they could go up to a man and say, hey, are you on your break? Do this. And that is how I got some data from men. Or being sent to somebody's sister and the sister saying, oh yeah, that sounds really cool. Me saying, hey, can your brother do X? Yes, I'll make him. So basically identifying the people in the community who could get me access to other people who are otherwise more difficult to get information from.
Yes, so true. I think that I spent more time talking about all the various ways you could use mayonnaise in different recipes, trying to build those connections.
So there's a question actually in the chat. Yeah, so this is something that I've actually tried before, but bureaucracy is the biggest problem. So basically, when I work on Plotich, I'm generally the only one in my department who is interested in working on it or doing cross-site research. So I usually work in multiple places. And the way that the clearance works for doing a project, you have to list all of the co-workers on the paperwork to be approved to do the research in the first place. And coming from a school where you have a large contingent of Amazonian researchers or people who work on Californian indigenous languages and stuff like that, they're doing endangered language research, but they're doing research on things that are critically endangered. So a lot of the resources go immediately to that. So in order to actually get someone who wants to work on an underdocumented language like Plotich, you would have to go to another university. And in order to get that other person's information on the research protocol, it takes a lot of bureaucracy and jumping through bureaucratic hoops. I actually had one protocol for a project shut down by a university because they couldn't figure out on their own end how to get this person incorporated. And they said, we just don't want to deal with this anymore, and shut the entire protocol down.
Dr. Shahar, did you want to tackle either the question of how you entered the community or the question about co-researching and whether you've done that? Sort of open possibilities here in terms of where we go with the conversation.
Wow. So thank you. I would like to talk about how I entered this community, but this is such a long story. So hopefully I will come to the next conference and I can tell it. But I will start with from the end. I can just say that I'm very, I feel jealous for all of you that you're in the States and you have option to see your Amish friends. I try not to cry, but Professor Anderson knows that I already had visa to enter again to the States. I almost had the ticket, but I had to cancel it because the situation here in the COVID just changed last week. So I will not see them. And I miss my Amish friend. Like, I can't remember that I miss somebody that is not family, of course. And in such, I just cry when I think about them. So I can say that the issue is not only to enter the community, the issue is when the community just come into your heart, and you can't, I would say, I have the picture of them here because I had a photograph that somebody took a long time ago. So I look at them and I cry because this is not just research. This is part of my, family. And in terms of entering, as I said, the story is very long, but I can say that when I stay with them, you talk about recipes, I wash dishes. I can't count how many dishes. I fold laundry. I clean the floor. I work in the field. It's such hard work. So I have only 3 children, but I used to bake and to cook and to do everything here. It's very acceptable here in Israel, but I never worked in a field, and I couldn't imagine how much this is hard work. And you just finish with the peas and you want to rest, but then you have to shell it and to cook it. And from such a huge balls of peas, you get such a few. And I said, you worked so hard. This is only what we get. I can't believe it. Now I appreciate much more. But then you taste it and you understand that everything you tasted before, this is not the real food. This is, now you understand what does it mean. And the only thing I could do and they couldn't is to drive. So I drove them, and the situation just, I remember that, and I try not to cry. Driving all around the country, it was such a nice place. Everything is nice and green, and so many happy women around me run from one shop to another to pick this, to pay that, to whatever. You feel sense of women community. And sometimes I said to myself, you choose such a nice life study, you just do that. However, sometimes after more than 90 minutes of washing dishes, I have a back problem. So I couldn't even stand more. And then came all the boys with the lunchbox, with the huge lunchboxes, and, open it and clean all of that and then dry all of that. Then I say, who choose? This is this research. So, but this is their life. And I'm so happy that I had the experience, and hopefully I will have it again. The situations, experience that you share somebody else's life. And it is not just to get access and get data, is to try to be part of them, even though I do really agree with you, Dr. Barnes. You can't really be part of them, and they always remind you, and you feel, you're just different. You're not just part of them. But sometimes when you talk about recipes or you work in the field, you feel sort of part of them.
Thank you. Dr. Clifton, do you want to share?
Sure. Our situation was quite a bit different. Megan had grown up in the community. Her parents had converted to, so it's not her, she wasn't there traditionally, over many years, but she had grown up in the church there. I felt very comfortable in the communities also. My heritage is Mennonite, and although by the time I was growing up, we were in I grew up in a conservative Baptist church, but culturally it was very similar to the community that Megan had grown up in. But even growing up in the community, Megan, of course, still had. She's coming in now as a researcher, she had left the community by that time. Both of us had rejected certain of the core tenets, especially in regard to the patriarchy of the churches that we had grown up in. But she had still maintained the relationships with people in the community that she had grown up with on a social level. But this is where I think the choice of your research methodology really comes into it also, because Megan, we decided that she would do the work in terms of oral history framework, in which she was working with the narrators. And it sort of reminded me of one of the things that Rivka was saying, that one of the underpinnings of the oral history methodology is that it's driven by the narrator, not by the researcher. And I think that this opens up things that the narrator now starts to feel safe, because the narrator feels like if there are things that she doesn't want to talk about, that's not an issue, because a good interviewer is trying to observe where the narrator wants to go and what the narrator feels is important in her situation, in her environment, in her in what she sees as important. And so I think that is what allowed Megan to have, Corey, as he was reading some of the quotations, commented that it sounded like it was simply a conversation between two friends. And I think that's what it really did become, that they really just enjoyed talking to each other. And that then was really important. So let's see, we have a question here. If someone who had not been part of the community had done the interviews. Yeah, I think that it would have. Okay, so the question is, do you think that the findings would have been somehow different if someone who had not been part of the community had done the interviews on modest dress? I think the biggest thing is it would have taken a lot longer to feel accepted by the community. That since Megan had already, these were not personal friends of hers, but they were friends of friends or friends of family that she was interviewing, and it automatically gave her a way in. And so that I think really opened up possibilities for her that maybe would have been there for other people, but it made it much more available to her within an hour and a half, 2 hours, because of the fact that she already had this relationship with the community. So yeah, I think that, but I do think that one of the things that we tried to be very clear about in writing up the paper is that you need to also make that clear as you're analyzing and as you're reporting on it, that you have this kind of relationship with the community, because this is going to affect what is available. And I think this is why, for example, in our situation, it was unique in that all of the narrators were willing to be identified by name, and were even willing to have all of their interviews archived, and they're all archived at the University of Kentucky archive, so that they're available for other researchers who are interested in hearing the voices of the Mennonite community, that these will be available hopefully in perpetuity. But I think it's because of the relationship that Megan already had.
Thank you. And Dr. Thalheimer, probably such an interesting story about building trust and listening to voices and entering into the community that you serve.
When I was assistant superintendent at Fairfield, we started a business advisory group so that employers in our area could help inform what we were doing at our school, particularly on career tech pathways and just understanding what we needed to be doing for students once they chose their 12+ path. And so intentionally, we had asked a couple different Amish businessmen to be on that group. And that had been in place for a few years prior to the work that we were doing on converting Millersburg to a K-8 building and subsequent things that we did. So I also had a superintendent's advisory council a couple years later when I became superintendent, and we had Amish members on that as well. And so I had established these relationships with the community through those functions and just making them integral to what we were doing as a school district. So they saw me as an ally. And then, of course, when we made the changes that we did to Millersburg, they knew that much of that was intentional to make sure that we were meeting the needs of all of our school community. So when I went to do the research, the dual role that I played, we knew was kind of complicated because my role as superintendent opened the door for those conversations to take place. People trusted me and knew me. But then the flip side of that was, did they feel that they were obligated to me because of the things that we had done? Did they feel that if they told me things that I didn't want to hear, that there would be repercussions for programming or for their children? So my advisor, Dr. Donlin, and I really weighed all of that out and thought through that. And my first explorations were, if I didn't do the research, who would? And I had conversations with the Menohoff Historical Center over in Shipshewana and said, would this be something that you, as an organization that deals in this history and this sociology, be able to do? But they didn't feel that it would fit with their mission. Doing it through Goshen College was a conversation, and one of the members of my dissertation committee was Tom Myers, who has written on the Amish and wrote a book with Stephen Nolt on the Amish. And Dr. Myers, as we discussed, kept coming around to the fact that you're probably the one most able to do it. We also have an organization in our county that brings together nonprofits, business, and this public school superintendents all sit on the board. It's a Horizon Education Alliance, and they work in this circle. But we kept coming back to the fact that if I, as an Amish family, received a letter of inquiry from this organization, they would not know who they are and would not be likely to take part. So we worked through our institutional review board at Indiana State for me to be the one to do it. Dr. Myers wrote a statement in support of me needing to be the one to do it. And we just put in place the processes of sending out the letters of request from me personally, but everything was randomized, everything was kept anonymous. Materials that came back to me were in, unmarked envelopes, and Dr. Donlin received all of those and drew them at random for me to be able to interview. And so as much as we could, we kept it blind so that, I would not know who was accepting until I sent out the invitations for the interviews. So that multiple role that I played was complicated. And as Dr. Clifton said, we addressed that specifically in the research as I get to the end of my paper, and I addressed it in my dissertation regarding, it is a unique snapshot of ethnography in this place and at this time because of that relationship that I had. And ultimately, as I looked and coded and analyzed my interviews, I think much of what I may have heard in reluctance to answer or was just a general deference, and not necessarily covering and hiding things or not being truthful with me as fully. I really interpret it as being just that deference that's part of the fact that they were speaking to an authority, which again is a layer of complication to what you truly would like to see. But again, the door that allowed the interviews to even take place, on balance, provide richer analysis than if someone else would have done it. So that's why we did what we did.
Thank you. I'm wondering if we could maybe open the questions to specifically any folks from the Plain Church who are here joining us today and want to ask questions of our panelists. And this would be a great time for you all to pose those questions. And if not, then maybe we can hear from the other folks in our audience today.
It's just 15. You should wait till 30.
There's a question from Robert Williams to Dr. Thalheimer.
Would you like me to go ahead and answer that, Natalie?
Sure, or maybe we could just wait just a few more minutes, just a few more seconds, and see
Sure.
if there's anyone from the Plain community that wants to ask a question to our panelists. We would love to hear from you now. Is there anyone out there with a question?
There are some empty spots on my screen. Are they actually there, or is it people who haven't joined the cafe?
So that could be because their cameras are turned off. We also have some folks who have called in, and so we have a whole variety of folks joining us today. If you're on the computer and would rather just put your question in the chat, that's an option as well. We can all see that. But do you want to go ahead and answer that question, Dr. Thalheimer?
One of the areas of concern for the parents in the interview was the role of technology and use of computers. And I learned a great deal in my conversations with these families that there tended to be a lack of understanding of how Wi-Fi worked and the access coming into the buildings among some families, but other families were very astute to that and understood how that worked and referenced how there were Amish businesses that had computers that weren't necessarily connected to the internet and were very stripped down to where they just had productivity software on them. And you'd even have those computers run by generators, printers run by generators, rather than necessarily being connected to the grid. So one of the things that came up in the conversations in a lot of instances was this notion of schooling versus training. In the interviews, if you had any notion that you were going to continue schooling beyond anything that was going to go past 8th grade, then that seemed to be that slippery slope that would undo Wisconsin v. Yoder. So they would talk in terms of training. So a couple different individuals that I spoke with were very interested in this notion of, could there be some kind of training beyond 8th grade? So maybe students would benefit from career tech or vocational training within a particular setting that would do maybe specific computer training, specific training for logistics or manufacturing, additional work for students on small engines or woodworking. So the notion of doing some kind of training beyond that 8th grade schooling was something that people were open to. However, within Elkhart County, because we're such a manufacturing community and there are so many jobs available to work within our RV plants and manufactured housing and those areas, that the push to do that just isn't quite there yet. Especially right now as we're emerging from the pandemic. I mean, there are thousands of jobs open that anybody could step right into. And so it just hasn't emerged as an absolute need, that while agriculture and agronomy is shrinking and this other sector is growing, it's just kind of displacing one with the other, and the high skill set that some of that additional training would provide them isn't quite seen as a necessity yet.
I kind of want to address the comment that was made by Kristen Park. So Kristen wrote a general comment and suggestion to all panelists. I'm so impressed by your reflectiveness and intentionality as qualitative researchers. Please consider extending and publishing your research design and qualitative methods journals so that a particular researcher audience learns more about Anabaptist and ultra-Orthodox communities. The thing that I would say about that is I've tried publishing this stuff in other places, and the current forum, I think, is a very important forum to have, specifically because of the questions that Dr. Natalie Jolly is asking us. These questions about outsiders and what's it like gaining access. These are things that when you have peer review from other journals, the researchers don't necessarily understand who are reviewing your paper. They wonder, why isn't this like 1960s New York? Why isn't this like any urban community that you would join today? Sure, they're the Amish. Everybody knows about the Amish. And the answer is no, that's not true. So in one case, I got a negative comment back from editors of a journal because I had mentioned trust issues. I viewed it as being very open, very straightforward about what working with the community is like. And they viewed it as, you just don't know enough. You just haven't done your work. And it's like, well, I'm also competing for attention with proselytizers. So here I am as someone who has no interest in converting people, who has to convince people that I'm not trying to convert them, that I don't have ulterior motives. So in that respect, I think it's really important to build up first within an accepted forum concerning Amish and Plain Anabaptists, what it is that we're doing, and then extend our work from there.
Thank you, Roslyn. I understand exactly what you're saying. It's discouraging to hear that, but perhaps not particularly surprising. So, yeah.
I would say that sometimes, look, I thought that I'm the only one that gets so many rejections, but sometimes I'm not sure. We talk about connection or language or enter the community. I'm outsider in the, not only with the Amish, I'm outsider, I'm first generation in the university, in my family, partly in my culture. So it's very easy to say something like, you are just not part of us. And we don't want your article, we don't want your research. So I can say thank you so much for your journal, because you really want to get more, let's say, knowledge, more than research about the Amish. But you're right, I will not mention so many rejections and names of journals that, look, after some years when I published more and they knew me better, they got what they didn't get before. It was almost the same, but sometimes they just try to push you out because, no, we know, like you said, Dr. Barnes, we know everything about the Amish. We know everything. You didn't say something new. Yeah, of course, they didn't find anything about that. So this is my research. And I can say that even here in Israel, people told me that they know everything about ultra-Orthodox women when it was only one research about them. But they didn't want to listen to me. So sometimes at the end, the Amish get you better than part of the academic culture, that they are so, I don't want, recording, but they're so proud of themselves. And maybe the Amish with their, they are plain and simple. They try so hard not to be proud. They know how to listen.
We have just a few minutes left on our hour together today. And if you are on the phone and you want to unmute on your phone pad, you can press the star button and then this number 6 key to unmute yourself and join into the call that way. And is there any, I'm curious if there's any other questions, or if we might want to just take a minute and hear sort of a final thought from each of our panelists. Would you all be willing to give us just a final thought on our conversation today? And yeah, Dr. Burns, did you want to begin?
New questions in the chat.
Oh, okay. It looks like
So
if panelists want to share thoughts
there's a
on
lot of questions
public
in
health.
the chat. I think we should probably have a few comments wrapping things up from people. I know I've got my own pile of questions too, but I just like to hear some takeaway thoughts from everyone in the last 5 minutes.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and start and try and keep this quick. And I think that one of the important things that I've learned through my research is that there actually is a thirst for research in the community. This is something that I hadn't really understood before because of being an outsider, because of this desire to kind of create distance, create a barrier. But it was specifically through working with one of my consultants in particular that she was able to write her own book. And get it published about her own family history. I didn't realize that she was missing this information where I knew exactly, oh yeah, you need to go to X, Y, and Z library. Here, let me put you in touch with so-and-so. And it was specifically through listening to her concerns about documentation and about preservation that I was able to apply myself in a way to lend her the ability to have her own voice. So I always do plugs for Tina Siemens. So if anybody is interested, she does her own family research and history that has been very valuable in shaping my understanding of what has been happening within the Mexican Plotiche speaking community.
We'll keep the turn. I will continue very shortly. I think that maybe another important word that all of us needed in contemporary life and pandemic time is to respect. And I can say that here in Israel, there are too many religious communities that don't want to get the vaccination, and many people believe in Bill Gates theory or whatever. And sometimes this is the people I really love. I love them deeply. However, I feel that I'm so angry with them. And the solution I find is to respect. So maybe we have, as people that try to study other community, so many tensions just in our heart. And then when you remember yourself to respect them, everything could be different. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, I want to, I'll just make a quick comment about one of the questions earlier. That is the possibility of co-researchers. And we just started dealing with what do you do in terms of getting into the community in the first place. And one of the things that's been commented on a number of times is making sure that people keep their anonymity and so on. And that really does stand in the way of now co-researcher, because now not only are you recognizing the person, but you're putting their name into that co-author spot. And it's that's something which is very scary for a community which has traditionally tried to avoid the spotlight. And I'm encouraged to hear comments about things like Roslyn's comment about the person who decided that she's going to publish just her family history. I think that that starts to open the door in a non-threatening situation, because I think that things like family histories are less threatening than our organized academic researches. And that I think the more we can encourage members of minoritized communities to be involved in things like that, the more they're going to be open then potentially to the possibility of co-researching in some of these areas that we've been talking about that are going to feel scary to them for a long time.
I would just share that one of the things that stood out to me with my conversations was the desire for several of the people I spoke with to just tell their story and to be understood, and the reflection that they made of, we just really want other people to understand us better. And they would reference the prosecutorial history of their faith and what happened in their origins and the history in Europe, and in general the view that if things get too conflicted, then they just fade away. And their general conversations with me were, this provides them an opportunity to maybe not fade away and to maybe build a sense of community and to be understood. And they appreciated the opportunity to take part in the research and build that understanding that does the best for everybody, and they know that if they were working or had their students attending an Amish school, they'd be volunteering, they'd be paying tuition. So they did feel a sense of obligation to participate in the fundraisers at the school and even to participate in my research, because it just helped overall build that sense of community and understanding that they feel is so important.